where's my thing? Here it is. Okay, I have my notes. This is being live streamed to schools around Vermont and also to lots of other people. So thank you for being part of that. This is a great honor to have Richard with us. We want to extend thanks to the partners, of course, as well as to the underwriters that made it possible to bring Richard to Vermont. The sponsor of this author residency is actually the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute for Museum and Library Services. We're also really happy to be here at Hartford High School and to thank Rebecca Whitney and all of the students, staff, and teachers that have been involved in making it possible for you to be here today. Finally, a special thank you to JAM for making the live stream happen. I'm going to welcome Rebecca up to the stage, who's going to introduce Richard and get us started.
Hello, thank you to everyone who's here in person and joining us virtually for this special event. Thank you to the staff and students for being here today and to the Vermont Humanities Council for selecting Hartford High School to host this important occasion. I would like to take some time to introduce and thank our student panelists. We have Dallas Kelly, Nora Wood, Jonah Liebens Mavadonis, and Laura Belmont. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Richard Blanco. Richard Blanco's collections of poetry include How to Love a Country, City of 100 Fires, which received the Agnes Starrett Poetry Prize from the University of Pittsburgh Press, Directions to the Beach of the Dead, recipient of the Beyond Margins Award from the PEN American Center, and Looking for the Gulf Motel, recipient of the Paterson Poetry Prize and the Thom Gunn Award. He has also authored the memoirs For All of Us, One Today, An Inaugural Poet's Journey, and The Prince of Los Cocuyos, A Miami Childhood, winner of a Lambda Literary Award. His poem for President Obama's second inauguration, One Today, was published as a children's book in collaboration with renowned illustrator Dav Pilkey. And now, without further ado, Richard Blanco.
Not a good day. All right, did you hear any of that? Let me start from the top. Thank you to Vermont Humanities Council, to all of you here, to all of you out in Streamland, and again to my interviewers here. Can't wait to get to that. I thought today what I'd do is just share a little bit about my life's journey in relation to writing, and then skip to the interview, and maybe read a poem. We got to read a poem. It's National Poetry Month, so. So I grew up in Miami, a child of working class immigrant family, and because pretty darn working class, lower working class really. And so as a child, even as a teenager, and even as a young adult, I had very little access to poetry and very little access to the humanities in general. The business in my family was survival. And then there were other roadblocks that sort of impeded my sense of following a creative artistic career. Obviously, the practical choice of being an immigrant, you had to earn a living, whatnot. I wasn't a trust baby. The other thing was a cultural divide. So my mother has yet to speak a sentence to me in English, so there's a cultural divide between my family and myself. So what little my parents did know about arts and whatnot, it was all about Cuba. So it wasn't, my parents didn't even know who the Rolling Stones were, or it was just a real cultural divide. And then my grandmother, who was a real pip and was my primary caretaker, was a very homophobic person, and so my career choices were a little bit limited there too. One time I wanted to study architecture, and she thought that was too gay. So I went on and studied. I should also say that I was one of those weird kids. I was left brain, right brain. I loved math, I loved art, I loved everything. I still love everything. So when it came time to decide on a career, I actually became a civil engineer, and had had really no ambition of becoming a poet at all, or that wasn't on my radar. I knew I wanted to do something creative at some point in my life, but I didn't know what that was. Anyway, I graduate, I start working in a consulting firm, and lo and behold, much to my surprise, half of my job is writing. Writing reports and studies and proposals, which are narratives, proposals for $40 million jobs. And you get that proposal, you win that proposal, and guess who gets promoted? So writing became really important in my job, but also my right brain clicked on and said, hey, this language thing seems really interesting. I wonder what I can do with this. And I thought, what do I know nothing about? Poetry. Let's study that. So I just started following my creative and intellectual curiosities. Started writing really bad poems, really bad rhymey poems. That was my archaic sense of what I thought poetry was. I was writing poems about daffodils and stuff in the middle of Miami. I'd never even seen a daffodil. But eventually I signed up for a workshop course at a community college and started really getting better and really falling in love with the art form. Eventually I applied to a master's program in creative writing and was rejected the first year. But they did allow me to take graduate courses because they saw some potential, but they weren't sure how far I could go. So I ended up doing that and getting accepted the second time around. But I never quit my engineering job. So I was engineer by day, poet by night. And even after publishing or started publishing books, graduated, published books, I was still working again as an engineer. Some of that was obviously a practical choice. As a lot of interviewers, a lot of people that interview me, they think that, that I hated engineering and that, I discovered poetry and my life all came into place. And I always like to joke with them, I really wanted to go into poetry full time because there's so much money in it, right? I mean, it was a very practical choice that, not even a choice, really. I had to, again, earn a living. But I was very committed to the art at the same time. And then, won awards along the way. But the real game changer was when Obama called from the White House in 2013 and asked me to serve as 5th presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history, and I've never done engineering since then. So that was kind of a sign from above, and that's what I've been doing, just living the dream in a way, really working, living off my writing and my teaching as a poet. So I guess I just wanted to share that with you because maybe three reasons. One is for you to understand how important the humanities are in any field. Writing is important in any field. By the time I was a senior engineer, about 10% of my job was engineering. The rest were all people skills. They were all about management skills, but they weren't necessarily things that I learned in calculus. So that's one important thing. Also, the idea that I know you're probably all thinking about career choices maybe in college now. The idea that these things are siloed in our life. I've never seen it that way. My math has helped me write poetry. The logic and the structure and the problem-solving skills of of math, I use in poetry, much like music is very mathematical. And the other way around as well. Being a poet helped me understand human nature a bit more, helped me understand myself a little bit more, helped me be more aware, and that made me a better engineer and a better reader of people in the room and a better communicator. So I would say I'm a better poet because I'm an engineer and a better engineer because I'm a poet. So I just, the idea that you're gonna just do one thing in your life is not the reality, right? You need all sorts of skills that you may not think are applicable, but they will be in your career. So, and one of those is, people think that the humanities are just like for cocktail party conversation. They're actually something quite practical. I think they, like I said, they make us more aware, more empathetic. They make us more empathetic with ourselves, with others, and a better person is going to be a better doctor, lawyer, engineer, teacher, parent, etc. So yeah, that's my spiel. So I thought I'd thought I'd read a couple of poems just so you get to know that side of me. As I always say, my poems are much more entertaining than I am as a speaker and much smarter than me. This is the way I communicate. So I thought I'd share one really sort of personal family poem and one more social political poem, and then we'll chat. So this poem, let me pull it out here. So the story behind this poem, I had moved away from Miami for a while, and I really missed it. And so I finally moved back after about 8 years being gone. And I thought I was just going to fall back into the life I had there, plug and play. And of course, Miami had changed so much, and South Florida had changed so much, and there was kind of a disconnect. But I was going to my favorite spots and places and taking that proverbial trip down memory lane. And one of those was the Gulf Motel, which is on an island called Marco Island on the West Coast. And thinking, again, I was going to find this place exactly as I remembered it, and I hadn't been there in like 30 years. But it was a place that's really important to me since I was a kid to, even when in my late teens and early 20s. So this poem kind of speaks to that adage of you can't go back home. But in a way, it also speaks to ways that we can go back home, and the ways that things may not be there the way we remember them, but I learned in this poem that also my memories are always with me. So it lives with me anyway. And I think we all have a place like this in our life that we remember as unique and special, or maybe not yet, but you will maybe learn to appreciate it when it's gone, as they say. So I invite you to think about that place in your life as I share mine with you. Looking for the Gulf Motel, Marco Island, Florida. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents, embarrassing us as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a garlic roasted pork running through the lobby. All because we can't afford to eat out, mijo. Not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from our home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the whiter sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be for the first time watching the sun set instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Gulf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart still squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in a terry cloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of amber whiskey in the sunset at the Gulf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, 2 boys he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music, only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea. And the stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom and sculpting naked women from sand. And I should still be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the Gulf Motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach and my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky mansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the Gulf Motel exactly as it was and pretend for a moment nothing lost is lost. Thank you. Thanks. So this other poem takes its inspiration from two things, well, three things. One is the Zulu people, the traditional greeting is not like sort of we do in the United States or most of the world, like good morning and like, yeah, how are you? Fine. You know, my dog just died, but I'm fine. You know, the Zulu people look you straight in the eye, right? And they say, I see you. And the response is, and I'm here to be seen, and I see you. So this is the more socio-political poem that I referred to earlier. So my sense was that we have forgotten to see each other in this country. And part of that has to deal with the way that media and all the rest sort of social media and media sort of blinds us, right, or gives us only part of the picture. So this poem, I wanted to sort of break through some of the stereotypes with which we judge each other and divide each other. I'm also thinking here about the declaration of independence versus interdependence. So the higher levels of Eastern thinking, there's dependence is sort of the lowest place to be. Independence is the next, right? But interdependence, recognizing that one's lives is connected with every other life, that it takes a village, literally, is a sort of the next level of thinking. And I think we saw that a lot during the pandemic, right? How suddenly, the people that we may have not been paying attention to realized we're just as important as everyone else, right? Yeah, all that is in here. So, and it's interrupted by lines from the Declaration of Independence. Such has been the patient sufferance, where a mother's bread, instant potatoes, milk at a checkout line, where her 3 children pleading for bubble gum and their father, where the 3 minutes she steals to page through a tabloid, needing to believe even stars' lies are as joyful, as bruised as hers. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Where her second job, serving an executive absorbed in his Wall Street Journal at a sidewalk cafe, shadowed by skyscrapers, where the shadows of the fortune he won and the family he lost, where his loss and the lost, where a father in a coal town who can't mine a life anymore because too much and too little has happened far too long. A history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Where the grid of his main streets, blacked out windows and graffitied truths, where a street in another town lined with royal palms, at home with a Peace Corps couple who collect African art, where their dinner party talk of wines, wilted picket signs and burned draft cards, where what they know, it's time to do more than read the New York Times, buy fair trade coffee and organic corn. And every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress. Where the farmer who grew that corn, who plows into his couch as worn as his back by the end of the day, where his TV set blaring news having everything, nothing to do with the field dust in his eyes, or his son nested in the ache of his arms, where his son, where a black teenager who drove too fast or too slow, talked too much or too little, moved too quickly but not quick enough, where the blast of the bullet leaving the gun, where the guilt and the grief of the cop who wished maybe he hadn't shot. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and sacred honor. We're the dead, we're the living amid the flicker of vigil candlelight. We're in a dim cell with an inmate reading Dostoevsky, where his crime, his sentence is amends. We're the mending of ourselves and others. We're a Buddhist serving soup at a shelter alongside a stockbroker. We're each other's shelter and hope. We're a widow's 50 cents in a collection plate and a golfer's $10,000 pledge for a cure. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're the cure for the hatred caused by our despair. We're the good morning of a bus driver who remembers our name, the tattooed man who gives up his seat on a subway. We're every door held open with a smile when we look into each other's eyes, the way we behold the moon. We're the moon. We're the promise of one people, one breath, declaring to one another, I see you. I need you. I am you. Yep, on.
I'm Dallas. I'm a junior here, and this is my question. Of all the forms of writing, why do you think you were drawn to poetry, and who are some of the poets that inspire you?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I've always thought impressionistically. I've always thought through feeling, and poetry, what separates poetry from perhaps other genres is that it's much more like music, like it's the center of it is emotion. And that's just the way I always looked at the world. Like, you know, still to this day, like I'll see something and start crying, and I know it's a poem. So I think that's part of it. Part of it is also in my Cuban culture, poetry has a greater influence. Like my mom writes poems, and we're always, you know, we recite poems and things like that. So it has more of a place in the culture. Plus, it's a short form, and I had to write a lot of my poems at lunchtime, so I couldn't write a memoir at lunchtime. So that's part of it. I have gone on to write memoirs and nonfiction, and I found it interesting. After about 3 books of poetry, there were still some stories, especially about my grandmother, and some memories that I knew weren't poems. They were more like stories, and that's how I started writing the memoir, sort of exploring what my life would look like in prose. And it's interesting, new discoveries happen, and a lot of the characters in my life sort of changed. So that was interesting to watch. And then as favorite poems or poets, I do have a favorite poet. It's Elizabeth Bishop, which is sometimes people are surprised by because it's not a Latinx poet. But Elizabeth Bishop was effectively orphaned when she was 4. She's from Worcester, Mass. And she's been, I think she was always longing for home and belonging in a place in a different way than me. But you don't know much of my work, but that's at the center of my work, is this quest for home, for belonging and identity. And so I always connect with her, but it's really powerful. I know it's powerful when we read something that we can relate to, but it's really maybe even more powerful when you read something that you don't expect to relate to. And it makes me feel like, well, if I can connect with Elizabeth Bishop's, or surely readers that are not familiar with my story exactly can connect with mine. So she has been. But I always say I have more favorite poems than favorite poets. I have poems that I still read today. A poem is like music again. You can play it over and over again, and it always teaches you something different. So those masterpieces that I carry with me are still teaching me, and I still read them.
Hi, I'm Nora, and I'm a sophomore. So when you write, who is your audience? And when you write, what is your purpose for it?
Sure. So there's the easy answer to that, and I think that the truer answer is that I write for anybody that's breathing. I mean, I write for all humanity, ultimately. Of course, ironically, as Robert Frost said, the universal is in the particular. So I would say in that sense, I don't consciously write just for Cubans or just for poets. I write for everyone. But of course, that is sort of the audience that gets more of my work, I would say. Or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, I always write with the sense that this poem can mean anything to anybody. I just got an email the other day from a student in Kazakhstan. She just read my memoir, and she said, "Oh my God, my family is just like yours." And I'm like, okay. So I think, and not to pat myself on the back, but the ultimate goal of art is to transcend the very particulars that with which you have to work with, because then it becomes the emotional. What they're really connecting with is the emotion, even though I'm sure there's a big difference between Cubans and Kazakhstanians, but I think what they're responding to is if you can really draw out those core human emotions by telling your story. So yeah, my story is about home, but it's also, isn't that a universal quest, right? Don't we all have a longing for place and belonging? Of course, I have to tell it through my particulars, but what was the other part of the question?
When you write something, what is your purpose for it? Like, do you want to persuade somebody, or?
Yeah. Oh, so why write? Yeah, right. Like, why the hell get up in the morning and write a poem, right? So I'll tell you why I'm addicted to writing, and I will say that writing has different phases as you move through a poem or through a novel or through a memoir. And I always tell my students this: writing a poem is one of the stupidest, most arrogant, self-serving, selfish things you can do in the world. But it's also one of the most generous, gregarious, selfless things you can do in the world. Why? Well, I think a poem begins, you have to feel, it has to begin with thinking, this is my life and it's worth writing a poem about, right? And you have to dive into these emotions almost like very selfishly, right? But in the process of making art, again, you come to understand and you transcend the very joy or anguish or whatnot, memory that you came to the page, because it's suddenly you discover what it really means. And in a way, understanding it is a letting go. And that becomes the gift to the readers. Like I was saying earlier about connecting, that discovery, I think, becomes the thing that you give away, right? And as poets say, once we finish a poem, it's no longer ours, it's the world's. It's for people to consume and take into their own lives, like the Gulf Motel. It's about your Gulf Motel, not about mine. I'm just showing you mine to get you to think about yours, right? So that's part of it, and the addiction for me is that moment when I'm writing a poem, when I discover something new about myself, about the world, about a memory, about someone in my life, about a past love, you name it. That's what keeps me coming to the page. It's, in a way, a personal growth experience. It's a way of, it's kind of almost like spiritual, and it's really just that quiet time on your desk, and that's what keeps getting my butt back in the chair.
It's on? Okay. Hi, my name is Jonah. I'm a sophomore. And poetry is such an intimate form of writing. Is it odd to know that people in the audience that you haven't met know such personal things about you?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. I'm sorry.
Oh. Is it odd to know that people in the audience that you haven't met know such personal things about you?
Is it, I couldn't get, sorry. I'm actually need to get my hearing checked. My mother and I, you should see my mother and I in the same room. It's like, what? Something about the audience members?
Yeah. Is it odd to know that people in the audience that you haven't met know such personal things about you?
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, got it. Is it odd, right? Well, it relates to my answer here. Like, it's interesting because, at some point, the poem becomes a piece of art, and it's no longer necessarily me, but it's the art. So, granted, I'm not writing about really traumatic experiences, so I can't speak to something else, like maybe people that are writing about abuse of some kind or whatnot. But I would dare say it's kind of the same process. We come to the page to, in a sense, understand that conflict or that trauma, and in a way transcend it and offer that, right? So I think the same, that's why I don't feel exposed, because in a way it's the art, it's the poem, it's not me and it's not mine anymore, right? And it's the same way when we think about it this way. It's weird because writing does always come across that way, right? Like music, right? It always comes across like this is deeply personal, and it is, but you're making art, man. So it's the same as like a painting, who knows how much emotion and frustration and what that painting may mean to the painter, but there it is on the wall for everyone else. So I don't feel exposed. And for those of it, but I understand when you start writing, it might seem that way, but if you follow the process and get to discovery moment. The other thing is there are sometimes things that that you're not ready to write about. For example, my grandmother, and I didn't read you any of my grandmother poems, but that was pretty psychologically abusive. And it took me a while to write about her. And I don't know that I did not write about her on purpose or knowingly, but it was when she was much older that I started finally exploring this, also going to therapy and figuring it out. But again, the process, taught me something. I thought that it was all this pain, and there was, but I also realized my grandmother was my best friend. Like that she was a hoot. Like she was always gossiping. She loved to bet. I think she was addicted to betting, and so she played the horses and all this stuff. She ran an illegal betting thing in the back shed in the house. So, and she was my primary caretaker, and it's the person I spent most of my time with, and the person that paid most attention to me. So even if that was negative attention, even if she's calling me the F word, like, here and there, at least she bothered to call me the F word. It's ironic, right? But I'm not forgiving her. But well, I actually have. The writing allowed me to, first of all, get angry at her because I thought that was normal. I thought every grandmother calls their kid the F word, every day. First of all, to hate her, and then forgive her, and then finally love her. So even that I don't feel exposed anymore. So. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm a senior here. My question is, when you're commissioned to write a poem for an occasion, where do you start? Like, could you talk about your writing process, please?
Sure. So let me just get a little drink here. So commission poems or occasional poems, right? Like, so the poem for Obama was really literally my first occasional poem or commissioned poem. And it's not something I've started teaching it now in my graduate courses. I think it's important to understand how we can get poetry out there, right? To poetry at inaugurations of governors and whatnot. So it was baptism by fire. And I think what I learned was that the process of writing a personal poem versus an occasional or commissioned poem. I've also done commissioned poems for Sam Adams, for Bacardi, for all sorts of also nonprofit organizations like Freedom Mary. I've done poems for Silicon Valley, so I've gotten the hang of it. But I had to sort of negotiate. Okay, what's the difference, right? And I realized there isn't that big of a difference when we're talking about audience, right? So the one thing is, people think that an occasional poem, or writers think, is about the occasion. And I dare say it's not just about the occasion, right? It's about what the poet feels about the occasion that also feels that could bridge to the emotions of the audience in that context, right? So it's kind of finding that bridge, but in a way that's the same thing I'm doing when I'm writing my personal poems, right? I'm trying to understand what is the base emotion that I can share my life with that I hope will connect with others. And so in a way, in the inaugural poem, which you may have heard or not, there's a first version did not include me. I didn't include myself at all. I didn't include my mother. I didn't include my father. And I thought, wait a minute. These people I'm talking about in this poem, that's my story too. I'm one of these people in America. The poem talks about all of us moving throughout the day. And it's some of people's favorite parts are the personal parts, because I finally cared. It was like, I care about this occasion. So I think that's sort of the key. People think that an occasional poem is like, it's like a disembodied head talking, like this oracular voice, and it's really comes back to the same essence of poetry, is imparting your emotions in there and being authentic in there, so that readers and listeners understand that authentic humanity in you and connect to their own. So now that's one thing, right? So more about how I began writing, period. Again, there's phases of this. I begin by just throwing word, I mean, literally just gibberish, like, just images, sound bites, things I'm hearing, like, it's a hot mess. And when I always compare it to music in the way that also I feel like I'm just sort of, playing with the guitar or trying to tune the guitar, and eventually I hear something that makes a line or an image that obsesses me, and then I start building the poem off of that, and building the poem off of that, and of course revision and back and forth and whatnot, and then at some point, usually when there's that transcendent moment, I know the poem is the home stretch, and then it becomes more dispassionate. It becomes more like editing. It becomes more like fine tuning. Like, okay, this is not the exact right word or the exact right color and things like that. Then becomes the polishing process. So, I think the first step is very important. And for those of you that like writing, I've been doing this for 40 years. Poems do not fall from the sky. We were talking about earlier, there's some that almost feel like they do, right? And sometimes all the stars are aligned and you can write a poem in a day, but it takes me a good week to even get a draft, a decent draft of a poem. Yeah, poetry, it doesn't fall from the sky. It's in that very process that you're trying to mine your subconscious, right, through language, and it has to take shape. It's not easy. If it were easy, everybody would do it, right? But there's this myth that poems just happen. There's this myth about everything that just happens. Like, people think engineers know what they're doing. Not. Like, when I begin, no two bridges are alike, no two roads are the same. So every time, and it's creative in a way. You just begin with a certain amount of knowns and a certain skill set, but every time you still have to like discover and rediscover what it is this particular project needs. But isn't like everything in life, right? You wanna play the tuba? Well, what's the first thing you gotta do? I don't know. Tuba's such a kooky instrument. Sorry, tuba players, but first thing you gotta buy a tuba, right? Get a book on poetry. Then you also have to learn how to read music, and you have to learn the scales, and you have to learn the basics. That's the basics of craft, and then you have to practice, and then you become like a star tuba player. And do you think you can stop practicing? No. Same thing with a football player. Same thing with a ballet dancer. You name it. It's really the thread. It's really, writing is no different, is what I'm trying to say. For those of you that are writers, and for those of you that aren't, and think it's magical, it's just the process of creation, and trial and error. I was wondering, there's another round, right?
How do current events guide your writing? Do you think you write more about personal things and events, or more about a larger social commentary?
I think for the most part, I started writing. Well, there's an evolution to writing right now. So I think mostly I've written sort of family has become very important to me, and has been very important to me, and my childhood memories, and always again around the search for home, place, and identity, even as an adult. But just serendipitously, just before the White House called, I was through my fourth book, and I was just like, I had run out of stuff to talk about in terms of the theme of home and belonging. I didn't know what the next phase of that theme would be. And so in writing the poem, I realized, one of the hardest things of writing the poem was, again, the emotional part that was asking myself, do I even love this country enough to write a poem for it? And the other bigger question was, does this country even love me back? I don't fit that narrative, or at least I thought I didn't fit that narrative. Working class, immigrant, gay kid, I wasn't the kid on television that I thought I was supposed to be. And the poem is in a way a response to that in the affirmative. No, that's when I put me in there. So that book opened up a whole possibility of the occasional poem. And so How to Love a Country has a lot more of that. So I'm still asking the same question of home, place, and identity, but on this larger scale of what is a country? How do we love it? What does that even mean? How do you love a country that doesn't want to recognize their terrible past, right? That hasn't reckoned with it, right? How do you love a country that doesn't accept me all the time? So So that became that kind of home. Now, the next book that's coming out, I think it has to do with the pandemic, and I think it has to do as I wrote so much social political stuff that I had to sort of draw in a little bit, and now I'm writing really smaller poems and writing about a cut in my hand, and like I'm realizing that home is really, I've never lost a home and I've never gained one. They're always remain, or have always come from within. So the new book is called Homeland of My Body, and it's really understanding that the consciousness of home is something you always have with you. It doesn't depend on a physical locality, and it's not dependent on conditions. I'm not used to talking about the new book yet, but
How did your unique childhood experiences and the events of the world around you shape the way you wrote?
how my experiences as a child shaped what I wrote?
Yes, and just the world around you.
Well, I think that's how I landed on that very question of home. As I like to say, I was made in Cuba, assembled in Spain, and imported to the United States. So my mom leaves 7 months pregnant from Cuba as an exile, left her entire family behind, her parents, her 8 brothers and sisters, left everything and everyone she knew. I'm born in Madrid, and 45 days after I'm born, we emigrate to the United States. So by the time I was 45 days old, I belonged to 3 countries, to Cuba, Spain, and the United States, and yet to none. I think that already started in me imprinting this sense of place and identity, because my brother, who's 6 years and a half older than me, has no issue with home or place identity. I think I even felt that in my mother's body already at 7 months, right? So that sort of started, I think, already. And then growing up in Miami, if anybody's been to Miami, you realize it's not quite the United States. As we like to joke, we live living in Miami because it's so close to the United States. So it was an interesting childhood because you grew up between 2 sort of real imagined worlds. One was this Cuba of my parents and like the whole community at large, and this longing for this country that we were going back to soon. So don't get too comfortable, because as soon as Castro's done, we're going back. This place that's, you're going back. I've never been there, right? This place that supposedly was mine and I inherited, but I have no idea what that place really is. And then the other real imagined world was the United States. In my class, in my high school, 90% of the kids were, back then, Cuban. Same experience as mine. So the other was Vermont maple syrup, or like, stuff like that, and all these strange foods on television, and all these TV shows with like, I mean, we eat pork at Thanksgiving. Like, my first poem was about eating pork at Thanksgiving, wanting turkey. So there's this other mythical America that supposedly I'm in the United States and I'm an American, but who are those people? So all that shaped eventually what would become my obsession and my central theme in the work. And my grandmother eventually later, her and being gay, which I never thought as fit the theme of home, but of course now I've realized that's another manifestation of home, because we're craving home, right? In terms of safe space, in terms of when you do come out, especially back in my generation, you have to form a new family, a new community of support. You have to find those spaces that you can feel connected, and that's kind of a home. So that also made it.
At the time you read your poem at President Obama's inauguration, you were the youngest poet to do so, as well as the first immigrant. Did the intersectionality of all your identities impact what you wanted to say?
Yes and no. I mean, there was a temptation to write a poem that was much more that touched on those subjects, right? And in fact, the White House asked me to write 3 poems, and the third poem, which some of you read in class, How to Mother Country, was much more about my mother's journey, much more sort of grounded in immigration and whatnot. So there was a temptation to sort of steal that for me or for certain issues, but there's subtle hints in there. There's hints to engineering, there's hints to the LGBT community, but I thought I thought that wouldn't come across. I just, again, well, thinking about an occasion, right, is that, that million people standing right in front of me, I know some of them are going to connect to these issues and some are not. So let me go further deeper. Like, what is the real sense of the poem, which is, again, sort of making a comment, kind of like the poem of interconnectedness, of sort of, it becomes a poem of like, let's celebrate us and our connections and who we are as a people, and let's get it together, people. Like, because the poem ends, hope, which is a symbol for a star, a constellation, is a symbol for democracy, and it says, still waiting for us to map it, still waiting for us to name it together. The idea that we're moving through this country, but we're all part of participating in this world. So I purposely, not that I purposely, it's just never even crossed to my mind to steal that moment. So the mother poem is actually, again, much more personal, and then the people that I could trust to read it, because this is all embargoed, like you couldn't tell anybody. They all fell, my fellow poets, they all fell in love with the third poem, and we thought, okay, maybe Obama will pick the third poem, but he didn't. And then, and one of my readers, which is Julia Alvarez, who's right across the river. She's on this side of the river, right? At Middlebury College. Anyway, she said, it's a beautiful poem, but if you read it, it's going to look like you're stealing the moment for us meaning Latinos. And so it was some of the best advice. And that also taught me, actually, I went back and then revised the inaugural poem, because Sandra Cisneros, I don't know if any of you have read Sandra Cisneros, she was also one of my readers. She said, go back to that other poem and write it as if you're writing about your mother. And that was another great piece of advice. And I should say, in writing, that's another important thing: community, sharing your work, getting feedback.
Do you think poetry is an effective medium for talking about politics?
Depends. I think if it's done well, yes. But that's somewhat of my opinion. Writing this book, How to Love a Country, was some of the most social political work that I've ever done. My sense of using poetry as that is that, like any art, really, it should not state it needs to state, but also not stay there. We can't stay in the problem, right? I think art is about thinking about solutions, or not even solutions, but thinking about new questions, things that we're not asking of each other, that we're not asking ourselves. The proverbial light at the end of the tunnel. Poetry should also bring hope and whatnot. So I think when political poetry or social political poetry is just in the blame game and just stays there, to me, it's preaching to the choir and it doesn't move anything an inch. I think poetry, like song, should connect us rather than disconnect us. And so I always try to do that in all the poems whenever I approach it. And I have to approach it very delicately, because I want people feeling like they inspired or motivated to action, but in a way like they hadn't before, right? Like a new connection, something that's not fairly obvious.
Does the title of the book, How to Love a Country, apply solely to the United States, or do you think that the themes are universal to all humanity across the globe?
I think it's definitely focused on the United States and our history, but the book sort of arcs into thinking, sort of denying the idea of country, really. There's a poem about the Rio Grande, where it forms the part of the border between the United States and Mexico, and it's in the voice of the river, sort of giving it to all humanity for the absurdity of your invention of countries, right? And that's where I landed towards the end of the book, because I started realizing that this construct of country is, first of all, it's outdated. This idea of the nation state and like we have these neat borders and we're trading. Like we live in a globalized world now where everything is we saw that in the pandemic, right? Like our economies, everything are you know, you can hop on a plane and be in Beijing in 13 hours, you know? So, so I started sort of deconstructing that in my own mind and in the poems, and realizing that we have to get into like that poem interdependence, that we have to start seeing beyond country, and realizing there is really only one country, right? It's the earth, and our survival actually depends on it, as we know with climate change and whatnot. It's a hard thing, because I think what we're seeing in this country right now, and around the globe actually, right, is this knee-jerk reaction, because it's safe and nice to have a narrative of who you are and who they are, right? It's natural in some ways for us to seek that kind of stability and security, and thinking about, oh, I'm this and you're that, right? And I understand that. It's much harder to let go of those boundaries that you have of yourself, and thinking, well, maybe I'm not, in life is much more complicated, or maybe there's experiences that I also need to understand, and stretching yourself. And it's work, and a lot of people don't want to do that work, right? So I think, what we're going back now here is, right, we're reverting back to that narrative of I mean, it's in Florida, it's disgusting what's happening. It's just like, okay, the only thing that ever exists, wiping out history. We can't say gay in the classrooms now. We can't, one law is an injunction, thank God, but it's a stop woke act. You can't talk about certain things because it'll make people feel uncomfortable. I'm like, I guess truth makes people feel uncomfortable. That's the whole point. Idiot. By that I'm referring directly to our governor. Sorry, and I'm really like sort of a moderate, but this is just ridiculous. Anyway, I'm not gonna, obviously you struck a chord, but I don't even know what the question is. I'm running for office now. All right.
Next year, we're offering a class called American Literature, Dreams and Nightmares. What text would you read if you were teaching that class?
What's the title?
So, American Literature, Dreams and Nightmares.
Dreams and Nightmares? Oh, that's a great one. I mean, I can offer you what I teach, Latinx poetry, introduction to Latinx literature, but I just do poetry. So I would look at, I've also done a class, I imagine this is going in this direction, that class, but I also do a class called Poetry of Protest. So I would say to really look at minority, I don't know, calling minority writers, but Latinx writers, African American writers, because there is dream and nightmare, right? And as I was saying earlier, that I think a poem should have that dream aspect of it, but it often comes out of a nightmare, right? And also historically, sort of, I love thinking about how we get to write today is because of certain trailblazers and artists and painters and musicians, and poetry doesn't work literature doesn't always exist in a vacuum. To see who our forebearers are of these movements. That's what I would do.
We have another new class next year called the Philosophy of Literature, and students will consider the questions, what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to love? How would you answer those questions?
Well, okay, that sounds like a great class. I want to take that. What does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to love? Okay, let me take the easier one first. What does it mean to be human? To me, I'm just going to bring it back to also, I think, that's a big question, but to my work, and I think everything I am as a human is filtered through my work. So part of what I think it means to be a human is to be actively engaged with the world around you, and in the way that art does and the humanities can. Like aside from being addicted to my own personal discoveries, when I'm writing, I feel alive, like nothing in my life. Maybe even more than love. I feel like I'm not being passive. I feel like the world is not passing me by. I feel like, and it's not a matter of, I'm making a difference or anything like that. It's just being actively engaged, like Dead Poets Society, the Carpe Diem, like, you know, being in the marrow of world. And I think, and again, that keeps me constantly engaged in myself and aware and growing. And I think maybe that's, I guess, the most beautiful human experience, is to always be growing and learning and understanding in ways that make a life satisfying. I was reading an article in the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, anyway, was talking about, it was psychology, I love psychology, and it was talking about psychology, and they did like the survey, and they said the happiest, sort of, some of the happiest people in the world are people that have had multiple really diverse experiences, right? Like, that have never stayed still in one thing. I mean, they might have as a career, but that have always had, like, you know, like, he's a CEO, but like he flies planes, you know, like, so and they were doing this, and it stayed with me because that's why I can't stand still. Like, so I'm now writing TV shows, musical, just finished a play. I miss engineering, like, so I never. I guess being a human is never being still for too long, and always challenging yourself to learn and create and yeah, just. So what does it mean to love? I have no idea. So I'll just share one anecdote. Like, so I've been with my partner for 23 years, and we finally got married on October 22nd, 2023. I mean 2022. No, October 23rd, It's gonna be hard to remember the anniversary. October 23. It's also my PIN code, so I better remember it. October 22nd, 23, 2022. And I, you know, after 23 years, I was like, whatever. I was thinking this is gonna be no big deal. I flew up from Miami to our house in Maine. On Friday, it was like a pop-up wedding. We did it because we were afraid the Supreme Court was going to overturn marriage equality, and I hadn't realized what that was largely about. It was not about him and me, but like everybody showed up like last minute, and they're all like so happy for us, and like seeing your love reflected in them suddenly made me feel, I guess I must love this doofus. Like that was what's so beautiful. It was like, God, they see it, like, and maybe because we don't see it because we've been together so long, and like I'm getting teary. So I think taking love out of the romantic context, I think that's one of the most beautiful things, when someone's love can make you understand yourself and your love, and you do that back to someone else, right? And it's not always in the romantic sense, right?
Okay, I think we're done.
Okay, great, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.